All right, welcome everybody. I'm Andy Holton, as most of you know, faculty at the Studio Art program. First of all, let me say the first thing to ask you to do is to go ahead and mute yourselves so that all the things happening in your environment don't become necessarily part of our experience. Video on, video off is totally up to you. Second thing to say is thank you very much to Miss Chelsea Anderson, who organized is becoming our very effective specialist for getting these events together and putting it all in. We had a little conversation about what these events are like and how we're all adapting to it. And it is so fascinating to me the way that it feels like I'm at an event with all of these people that I know and like, and then, you know, in an hour and 15 minutes or so, I'll just be dumped back into my house kind of magically. It's such a bizarre experience, but it's really nice to see these faces and really nice to have everybody here. In a really quick housekeeping kind of thing, when we get to questions phase, in your interface at the bottom of your screen, you should have a participants link or tab there, and if you click that, you should see the option to raise your hand. So when we get to asking questions, I'll be kind of observing who has hands up and who has questions, things like that. There's also a chat function, of course, and if you want to go ahead and throw questions out, or if that's your preferred way of putting out communication, then please do that. Chelsea, am I forgetting anything?
Nope, I think you're good to go.
Very good. All right, on to the real deal. I'm really, really glad to be welcoming Amber Robles-Gordon to our first ever Midsummer Midday Visiting Artists event. It is a great way that we are able to kind of get back together in what has been a tumultuous time, and it's been a long time since we saw each other, and we all thought we might actually be seeing each other again before now. And so we thought it would be a really good idea to keep this kind of interaction going and keep the input for our own practices and keep the connection of our community. And just seeing some of the alumni and current students who popped up just now who I haven't seen in forever has kind of made this pretty special. So it's a special event, and it's fantastic that Amber was available and up for this kind of experience. Amber is a DC-based artist, a grad of Howard University's MFA program. She has a current solo show at the Universidad del Sagrado Corazón in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and recent solo exhibitions at Morton Fine Art in DC, Pennsylvania College of Art and Design, among a huge range of group exhibitions and a growing list of recognized and impressive public works commissions. And she is going to be bringing her work for a solo exhibition to the Katzen Museum in the fall, which is the great thing about us getting to know Amber and her work going into this. So without dragging that out any further, I will turn it over to you, Amber.
So I have one question, one housekeeping question, and that is how long I need a timer for myself. So what time do I need to be gauging?
You know, we could leave 10, 15 minutes at the end for some questions, but if it's about you getting through your work, especially because people always get to your really contemporary work closer to the end,
that's true.
I would love to hear about that. And so, you know, don't cut yourself too short. We'll survive.
Okay, so Chelsea, I need you to still be the gauge. You too, Zoe. Okay. All right, so like Andy said, my name is Amber Robles-Gordon. I'm going to be doing a combination of a little bit of reading, not too much, and then briefly making a couple comments based on the image. And I'm definitely starting out with older works, showing kind of the conceptual. Okay, why isn't this working? There we go. Beautiful. All right. My creations are representational of my hybridism, a fusion of my gender, ethnicity, culture, and social experiences. Through my artistic practice, I recontextualize non-traditional materials to large-scale assemblages, sculptures, installations, public art in order to emphasize the essentialness of spirituality and temporality within life. Driven by the need to construct my own distinct path, innovate, and challenge social norms, my artwork is unconventional and non-formulaic. The underpinnings of my artwork are imbued to reveal racial injustice. You guys are blocking the rest of my text. How do I, there you go. And the paradoxes within the imbalance of masculine and feminine energies within our society. I have what I would consider 5 main focuses, or focal points of my artwork: womanhood, color, nature and spirituality, materiality, and recycling. And I will break those down a little bit further. Womanhood. I intentionally impose imagery, colors, imagery, and materials that evoke femininity and tranquility with the intent of transcending or balancing a specific form. I associate working with light, color, energy as a positive means to focus on the healing power found in the creative process within us all. My goal is to symbolically communicate my concerns about gender inequalities, my personal experience, the experience of women in general, and or their connection to nature and spirituality. So the reason I chose this particular piece is called My Rainbow is Enough, and it was commissioned by the Schomburg Center for African American Cultural Research, I believe is the title. I could be wrong. But it was to celebrate, the curator was Solio, and it was to celebrate the works of Ntozake Shange's For Color Girls. And if you know anything about that particular play, it's a Kora poems, a series of Kora poems, which is like an integration of movement, dance, poems, and written word. And the way she broke down the actual movie, play, and all that is in 7 different characters, 7 female characters. And each of the artists that were presented with the commission to break down the core film, each of us was given 1. And mine was to focus on the very last portion of the play, which includes each of the 7 women. And each of the 7 women have a specific role, how they were dealing with race, how they were dealing with social injustice, and some of the gender inequalities that are unfortunately a foundation of this system that we live in and out of. So, and the very, again, specific reason I included this work was because it's based in chicken wire. And a lot of people that come to my work, which to some extent I'm okay with, they see color, form, energy, density. They see what's on somewhat the surface, but I literally use chicken wire to talk about the injustice that happens and the inequalities between male and masculine and feminine energy. So if you think about what chicken wire is used for, it's traditionally used to confine, to project a space of where you are allowed to be. And specifically, it was where hens were allowed to be. And then I use materials that are, I want to say, almost taken for granted. One of the reasons I use fabric, it's a second skin that we don't normally register in the way that we register our own skin, but yet we don't go outside without clothes and without cloth. We hide in it, we relish in it, we go too far in it. And so then I take these items and I weave them back through the masculine sculpture. So to some extent, I like that because color has its power anyway. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I like the fact that somebody who is just looking at my work visually, to some extent can just take it in for face value. And then for those that want to go any further as to the real reasoning behind why I construct the way I do, then I hope that they will seek further information. All right. So I believe color and light have healing properties, and each color emits a level of energy and associates color with both masculine and feminine energies. I associate each color with the thing or place that it exists in nature. Therefore, I'm usually basically working with nature. And I've always believed that creating connects me to my inner self and to a spiritual power. Even before I went into Howard University, it was very clear to me that creating was like my inner connection, not only to communicate, but also to self-regulate, to self-heal, and to empower myself. And eventually, I hope that also I hope to empower others. So, materiality. This one is long. Materiality is very important to me. My work is directed by the intersection of a concept that I want to convey, materials, color, and energy. And I define materials in a couple of various different ways. One is the actual found object or structure that I'm working from or working on, which is the foundational piece. Then you have the various items that I use for their masculine and feminine energy. So whether that be a tie or a bra, that I then weave, adhere, and or put onto the foundational structure or foundational material. I also use for the color of each material and or object. Then I select for texture to create depth and within the composition. I already shared that. Let's see. Okay, so recycling, I use found objects to recycle materials to bring forth a dialogue about societal consumption and global consumeration. Found objects with various colors, materials of their intrinsic value, energy, as well as to encourage recycling within communities and the world. I also believe that I associate each object with its intrinsic value, but then also that each object connects or retains a certain level of memory, experience, and energy in itself. And I use some of the items that I use for that purpose to then build on to a greater concept that I'm trying to convey. And these particular works in this image are called Cosmic Black. So I went crazy with my list of artistic influences, but the one I'm really going to speak about is Alma Thomas. And in the imagery, I cannot remember which the names of her two pieces, but her two pieces are on the top, and mine is on the bottom. This particular one is called, the bottom one is Alma and Amber. I was literally obsessed with Alma Thomas. I've told this story so many times, but I'm going to tell it again. Even though I'm tired of hearing it, I'm not tired of feeling my reaction when I share the story. And what it is that my mother she went to Georgetown and got a degree in language and linguistics. And through that, one of the classes that she took through the consortium was a art class at Howard University. And my mother dragged me to everything. So every art and cultural event, I was literally at her hip. And she definitely recalls, and I recall as well, being at one of I can't remember the name of the gallery, but it was the gallery in DC that was presenting Alma Thomas's work. And I remember coming up to that work and feeling like a level of energy from her work. It literally like took over. And so my connection to color started very early. And although I definitely create and work with color as I paint with objects, and I get something from it, I hope that people get a certain level of energy and recognition of their own connection to color vis-a-vis my work. So this particular work, the title is there. This is also Alma Thomas. I included this particular work because it talks about the grid and matrix. She used geometric shapes and patterns, usually vertically, to illustrate her kind of affinity with nature. And in my love of her work and appreciation of her work, I then began to either work in acrylic and or paper. And what I would do is the next couple examples, they'll show this, but I would begin to rip paper, usually magazine paper, because it left the pulp in between the paper. And I would use that to incrementally show the same level of energy that she used with leaving exposed paper. And this is something I didn't mention in the listing of influences, but also George Seurat and Impressionism, because of the way that they used pointillism and the white space in between each measure of color also brings in not only light, but it brings, in my interpretation, also brings in energy. And this is something that I wanted to convey through different mediums, actually, and you'll see that a little bit further in my presentation. But this was revealed to me through my own thesis work, and we'll see why a little bit later. This particular work is what I would call like a mock, because then I began to create works like this. These works are all from my Howard University graduate experience. This series is called Heal Thyself, and this particular work is called Metaphysical Planes of Life. So through my Howard experience, I was working with a personal injury. I had herniated discs that were just horrendous for me. And through that work, I was just pushing to continue through that time period. I was just pushing to continue on and deal with the measures of how pain was affecting my life. So in this series, I'm literally talking about how I'm managing through that pain through the manifestations of artwork. And this is talking about the 3 layers of existence. So you have the first, I hope you guys can see the actual layers, but you have the first layer, which talks about the spiritual realm. And you have the more inner and flowy browns and tans and whites that are inward, and that's talking about the emotional realm. And then you have the physical. So then I have, this work is called Glass Belt Bra and Purse Traps, part of the same series. This one is glass tile fabric on canvas. There's also paper. And this is where I talked about consumerism to a certain extent. But of course, it also is meant to appear as a landscape. And what started me on this path was my need to collect things. I get this from my, I think it's literally a tradition. My mother collects things. She's more in the line of language. She collects books, cards, all this really weird stuff, and hens. I hope she's not listening. But also my grandmother, she is also a collector. She's a collector. Both of them are a collector of plants and also little dolls and memorabilia. And it's really interesting. I also think I'm just, I guess in the lineage of that, I collect objects, and it started very early. And I couldn't figure out what to do with it earlier on in my life before I realized that I could then transform them into art. But the other thing I noticed is that how, as an artist, as you begin to look back at why you do the things you do, and then try and make connections through your own family to further your artwork and your existence, is how you can then track certain aspects of your work and your personality through your artwork. And that has been a tremendous, I dare say, privilege to be able to see some of the connections through my own family and as to why I am the crazy that I do, you know? Hopefully y'all know what I'm talking about and track it on through your own family and your own experiences. This is my mediums. This one I pushed a little further in relationship to how sediment and how earth stack and layer onto each other. I was still working through how do I deal with the pain and how do I physically finite these portions of life and emotions and physicality. But this time I was looking at trees and literally the formage of rocks and mountains. All right, so I'm slowly getting into how I went from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional works. And if you see, well, all the 3 works that I've referred to in the past 3 slides are on the left. And then there is this chicken wire form, square form that's wrapped around wood that I came across in the Howard University sculpture studio. And literally, this was not my work. There was no fabric on it at that point, and I kept on walking by it. And I was at the point in my Howard experience where I was trying to figure out whether I was going to continue in figurative work and or go completely to abstraction. And this is one of the things that really helped me make that decision, because I had to literally contact this other artist who left a certain portion of her material. She went to California, and I had to negotiate with her so that I could get this chicken wire, because every time I passed this chicken wire, it was telling me that it needed to be woven. So I did that. She agreed. She released it happily, and then I began to weave it. And if you look, the grid or the matrix that I mentioned, have I mentioned that yet? Or maybe I'm going to mention it in the next couple of slides. But this matrix of information, this backdrop of information begins to formalize. But now I'm taking it to a different medium. And this one I included, this process picture, is because I wanted you to see the levels of density. I can't tell you how much longer this was prior to the last image, but this is the same work as I began to continue to weave it with fabric, with ribbons, with beads. And then eventually that came to this. This work is called Flight of the Chicken Wire. And again, I'm playing with the notion of, or the actual use, traditional use of chicken wire. And then in relationship to what do you do, how in this particular piece, I'm talking about how women transcend their either state of being or their environments around them, and memorialize some of the more, I guess, traditional barriers that can happen within their lives. And one of the things about my work, which always trips me out, is that I don't think pictures do my work justice when it comes to the layers of whether it be materials or research or literal energy that I put into them, because you can't see the way, I'm going to start with my hands, the way that you have one layer of the actual chicken wire, and then you have the layers of fabric that are like literally woven into and then built up, and then you have the layers of extending beads that come out, and you can't see all that there. So, but I hope that you can still enjoy it in the state that it appears to you. Okay, so this series is called Wired, and again, I'm working with metal, some chicken wire, and I'm weaving the fabric in pieces onto the wire. It was literally about the wire and the relationship between a conductor and a force material on top of the conductor. And I'm including this because it was literally this was my thesis work, see the thesis body of work, a portion of it, the actual smaller scale sculptures. And the last image was also the kind of final work, which was the Flight of the Chicken Wire. This is an additional piece from that Wired series. And then I have one more, and this was the first, wow. Yeah, so this came before Flight of the Chicken Wire. So this was my actual first installation or large-scale sculptural piece. And now it seems so small, just in relationship to what I've then produced henceforward. But it was the first work that I'd done that was maybe 7 by 10 or 12 feet. And the base is chicken wire. And then I began to attach materials, fabric bras, metal objects onto and through the chicken wire. I still have a real love for this particular work. All right, so this work was commissioned by the DC, DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. And I was awarded an apprenticeship through a national call that they did. And this work is, crap, I can't see it. Whoops. I want to say this is Beyond the Visual Rainbow. And this was to celebrate the Deanwood community. It was a 2-year endeavor that I did with another artist. I cannot remember her name, Cheryl Foster. And then I worked with her through her creating of her particular public artwork, and then I was able to create my own. So this was my first actual public artwork, and it is 4 by 50 feet. It still hangs in the Deanwood Public Library in the Deanwood Recreation Center in Northeast DC, and I need to go by and check on it actually. So this work, this is really hard. I do not know how to move you guys so that you guys are not in front of my titles. There we go, at the altar, from the fruit of my love and labor. And it was one of my first works that I started to work in what I would call altar-like scenes or installations. And literally, it's about my love for my son and being a mother and the somewhat the joy, but also the plight of motherhood, the constant struggle that it is with bringing a little human being into the world and then having to watch them take on the different aspects of childhood, especially when they become so, self-actualized. And I remember a particular moment in around 2009 when I went through some familial problems were revealed to myself and my mother. And I remember thinking, this is so deep that I need to go home and create an altar. So then we literally came back to my home and I began to see that I already had aspects of altar situations already set in my home. Now they weren't all connected together, but they were like the beginnings of it. And then I realized that I needed to work some of the things out through my work. And so this is like the first iteration of that. And it is, mixed media on canvas. There's ties, there's definitely toys and or things that were actually my son's. And let's move a little further. Okay, can you guys still hear me?
Yes, I can anyway.
You can?
Yes.
Okay, good. I heard 2 yeses, so I'm going to take that as a yes.
All good.
Okay, great. This work is Milked Man, and it also comes from a series that I did prior, which is called Milked, and it was referring to, unfortunately, the way that sometimes women in general and mothers are looked upon as these bearers of children, of great, wonderful things in the universe. However, once those things are taken away from or taken either birthed, whether it be music, art, they are looked at differently than the actual, you're looked at as the producer and not the product. And this work is Milked Man. And it's literally, it's got like years of toys and or memorabilia of my sons. And this particular installation was at the University of Delaware. So this is All That I Am, a circular work, actually my first circular work. And this is the reasoning I included this, because eventually you'll see how the grid becomes a circle. And then it literally becomes almost like an undulation. And I then take the undulation into various mediums as well, along with the circle or grid, if I dare say. This is all that I am. The series is all that I am as well. This particular piece on the left is all that is constructed. Then you have all that is, which is in the works in the smaller series image. So this work I've actually shown at American University, and it is called Awakening the Matrilineal, which is the upper left image. And then I wanted to show like how, because this is a studio class that I'm speaking to, I wanted to show how it works, especially when you're working through installations, how it can migrate to various forms. And of course, then you have the one at the far bottom, which is the male and female. So the male is the left, which is a long title, the male, the architect, the protector. And in the middle, it is the universe. On the right, you have the female, the nurturer, the oracle. And the middle of the right bottom is called the one within. In 2000, God, I want to say 13 or 14, I was commissioned by the Washington Project for the Arts to create two things, to do a temporal public art installation. And then that installation, the image was taken of the installation, and then it was blown up till about, I want to say 20 by 30 feet. And it was put onto the Skyline Hotel, which is located in Southwest DC. This particular work, I do not think I put the other installation. Okay, I didn't. This particular work talks about, it's called Dance of the Serpents. And it is about the conscious, the ongoing unconscious and conscious conversation that you have with oneself, relating to the different aspects of what makes up your identity. And for me, one of the things that I have, that has been like a strategic part of my, my archetype is the snake, in the sense where I believe the snake is a protector. It has come in different forms, whether it be spiritual or physical, and it has become the protector energy that I have seen throughout not only my life, but also different aspects of some of the cultures and the places that I visited. And it is, yeah, and I know that it's counterintuitive to some people's interpretation of the snake, but the snake is my protector. I literally have a toy snake in my car that is my protector. And what I find interesting about that is that when people, and I don't let just anybody into my car, but I always notice the way that people register their emotional response, and almost like an outer response that happens when they actually see that, which I find a little interesting and somewhat telling. Okay, so this work is called Above All, You Must Not Play at God. And in 2015, I did a curator by the name of Mikhail Solomon, curator and friend, approached me about doing a show as part of a show called My Big Black America. And she wanted the show to include works that were about wood, or works that were done from wood. And at that point, I had never worked with wood. But what I did, at the time I was reading The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and I'll try and make that short. If you guys don't know Henrietta Lacks, she, in the 1950s, she was an African-American woman that lived in Baltimore She went to, starting to have abdominal pains, went to Johns Hopkins for care, and was, during her pelvic exam, a visiting doctor or doctor that she was not aware of took some cells from her, and those cells were later transferred to, they're later called the HeLa cells, because those cells have never actually died. Her cancer cells have never actually died. And to make it so short, is that her family, up until about now, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, because the book is probably about that old, her family didn't know that her cells had been basically kept alive, and that had been the impetus of medical modern science. For all of us that have been immunized, or that have the benefits of knowing what radioactivity does to your body, a whole range of, like, literally foundation of modern science, was because they could literally test it on her living cancer cells. But to that extent, after a year's time, she died. She did not get good care through Johns Hopkins. And even at the point when her family realized that her cells were still alive, some of her own family members still didn't have functioning health care. So this particular title is taken from the Hippocratic Oath. And underneath the actual installation, I have sliced slivers of the Hippocratic Oath, because I'm literally trying to challenge not only the oath that doctors take, but also the oath that any government official takes. You are not supposed to be selective on who you offer or render your services to or for, based on anything, much less the color of someone's skin. So in extension to that, what happened from that one beginning series, Above All You Must Not Play at God, I then began to be contacted to do other talking stick projects. This particular, the one in the far left corner, upper left corner, is I was commissioned to do a talk and lead a workshop, and then this public art commission at Salisbury University in 2017. And then the upper right and bottom left corner, I was commissioned to do a talk and presentation at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. on the Smithsonian. And so literally, especially of Salisbury, I was contacted by them, and they wanted to address, they were looking for a platform to address some of the issues that past students had brought up in relationship to being a person of color within their university. And this project, not only does it give me joy, but it's amazing to see how the process of one, through the learning about my art, and also how I ended up participating or creating with wood and the talking sticks in general, I've kind of been able to situate a situation where, through creating and or a series of circular events that happen afterwards, a certain measure of healing or a measure of looking at specific issues around social injustice. And I'm really grateful for being able also to tell her story as I do these projects. I'm going to skip this one, although that's hard because I love this work. But this particular series is called Third Eye Open. And I'm going to hop to the installation. So Third Eye Open represents an internal conversation about the interconnectedness of human life, for the infinitesimal individual to the expanse, in which our universe exists and operates within, yet there are laws of physics and highly shared beliefs and practices that hinge and bind us together. On the bottom right corner, this is Kepler 19b, and then Kepler 19c is on the far right. And while I was creating these works, I happened to be creating them and looking at or listening to I want to say that it was like some type of Smithsonian or Discovery Channel video. And they were talking about the discovery of Kepler 19b and Kepler 19c, and how these two planets, they were trying to figure out how these two planets were orbiting each other. And through that process, they realized that one planet, they couldn't see the other planet. And then the discovery was that this other planet was orbiting around. And I was just fascinated by that process of how, in some ways, the macro and micro versus science, and then our individual, like, minuscule human experience, how what we are working through can be just a minuscule representation of what the universe is going through. And so sometimes I try and bring that into my artwork. The other aspects about this particular installation is that the circular works, the fabric works that are out surrounding the outside of the inner circular works is called With Every Fiber of My Being. And I've literally been commissioned to do large scale installations with those. They're all handmade, of maybe like from 72 of them to I think the largest one is like 120 or 130 different circular things or forms for public artwork. Interdimensional Realms, this is 2017. This is a series of 2. And if I haven't mentioned it before, one of the things that I really love and really thank my mother for is like introductions to sci-fi earlier on in my life. And so I remember it's been an intricate narrative, part of my narrative. And there was a point in 2017 where my niece, I want to say that she was probably like 6 or 5, and I started to think about what things I wanted to, I wish I either existed already for her, and or that I wanted to make sure to manifest in some shape or form. And I also was wanting to work with perspective and creating realms of existence. So this work was about creating scenes of specific people of color. And it's wild. I say that, and all you can really see is these, biomorphic forms to some degree, and then the patchwork, what I would call paper mosaics. But when you hone into the little portions where there's actual figurative work, they are scenes of joy, scenes of love, and scenes of like a caring, nurturing of a Black existence, but they're put into what I would call these sci-fi silos. And whether she knows it or not, these are definitely because I wanted to influence what my niece's, I guess, projection or understanding of what is possible in the world. So this is 1 of 2, and this is the second. All right, so we're getting closer, 2018. This particular work is Remembering Who I Am. And I was literally was breaking out of a relationship, and I'm so sure we've all kind of been there. And this work is about literally deciding that I needed to remember who I am when a relationship failed. And it's also the first work for a very long time that I included members of my family, specific actual pictures of my family. And it was very important to me, if I go back to that grid where I go back and I insert a circle within the grid, and that actually there's maybe two main circular forms that I insert in that grid. And you know, I remember one person said that it looks, that it has a kind of like a feeling of being hurried or frantic. And that's what I wanted to convey. Literally, it's almost felt like I was reconstructing myself. And I needed to do it visually. So yeah. This is a detail. I found this red fabric at a thrift store. It was a dress, and I fell in love with it because it reminds me, one, of my relationship to Alma Thomas, but also, to me, it also reminds me of an iteration of skin. Okay, so this particular work is called Spectromatic Beacon, and I was commissioned by Martha's Table to do a public artwork that represented kind of their energy that they wanted to convey to their constituents that are coming into their headquarters in Southeast DC. And I included the picture on the bottom right to show you this, so you guys can see the scale, because there's literally two very tall human beings to the right of it. And also, you can also see how I took one, the matrix, the grid is still there, but then using a different medium to kind of illustrate that continuum of symbology throughout my work. This is a very recent series called Temple of My Familiars. And it is about the intersections between my identity, the diverse visual languages in my art, and the narratives they reference. This title is most definitely borrowed from the 1989 Alice Walker novel, Temple of My Familiars, a womanist narrative about several women of color and their evolutionary process to know self, their identity, and their struggle for happiness within a patriarchal society. So I was preparing to go to Basel and thinking about what I was going to work with, the works we were going to present through Morton Fine Arts. And I went back through some old piecings of work, and I dare say I had a ball going through the different elements of literally the collections of items that I kind of expressed or alluded to earlier. And also, if you look at the top middle part of this work, you'll see that there are these drawings of what I would say my public artwork. And what I decided to do was to flip the drawings, literally flipping them and then placing some of the elements underneath them as though they were all building up to these basically upside down public artworks. And it spoke to kind of what public artwork has meant to me throughout my career, being almost the umbrella, the foundation of how I've been able to maintain this life I lead as an artist. This is another Temple of My Familiars. This one is Identity Totem. And again, if you look, the other aspects of this is that I took the triangle, always going back to my love of Alma. I then took the triangle in place of where, to break down that grid, where she puts the brushstroke, and then I took the squared ripped paper. I then changed it into a triangle through a past series, and then brought them all back to create this the series Temple of My Familiars. So back to public artwork. In 2019, later in 2019, I was commissioned by Dashboard, which is a curatorial project I think they're based in Atlanta. And they partnered with Stephanie Reiser of the Nicholson Project and here in Washington, D.C. And I was their first participant, and then of their residency. And then they commissioned me to also create this public artwork. And this is called Fertile Grounds of Minds, Wombs, and of the Earth. And it is literally talking about ovarian cysts. I was going through a health issue, and after I started to research and literally ended up having to have a surgery because of it. I started to think about, when have I ever had a conversation and or seen artwork that was specifically about this particular type of women's health and or health issues that women are going through. And not to say that there are not works out there that have reached to a certain level of prominence, and or artists who talk about women artists that talk about their health that have reached a certain amount of prominence, but it's not done enough. And I wanted to literally take this installation there. So you are literally looking at a three-dimensional, what I would call like rendering or extension of a womb. Again, I am, if you can't see or make that out, those are talking sticks to some degree. And I wanted to hold that or use that aspect of language or narrative, because I wanted, so I just backtrack for a second. If you guys can remember the image that I started with, it talks about, it was branches, and it was called Above All, You Must Not Play at God. One of the works in that installation was called Without a Black Woman's Consent. So whenever I work with talking sticks, I see that as an extension of talking about Henrietta Lacks, talking about my own health, and talking about other things that are done without not only a Black woman's consent, but without a colored person's consent, and or without a woman's consent. So I see that as a continuation of that narrative, that conversation, pushing forward. Also, this is also about the issues that we have as a society with recycling and the reusing and abusing of aspects of plastic, metal, things that we haven't figured out how to put back in successfully and without hurting the earth. We haven't figured out how to put them back. So there's also that aspect, because one, if you know anything about cysts or fibroids, it's to some extent beyond like the metaphysical aspect of looking about it, the actual physicality of it. It's about something that we have not figured, our body has not figured out how to repurpose, that mass and collects as a tumor. So I see these as part of the same conversation. Okay, so I think the next image is a detail of it, so kind of to the right of it. So, and we're in 2020, and this particular work is The Botanical of Love, Self-Reflection, and Spirituality. And in 2019, I started kind of a self-appointed residency and also a visiting artist program with Universidad de Sagrado de Corazón, Sacred Heart University in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And this was a really important endeavor for me because I was born in Puerto Rico. I am Caribbean. My family's from St. Thomas. I'm literally Caribbean. I have family in St. Thomas, St. Croix, St. John, Antigua, Puerto Rico. But the majority of my family is rooted in St. Thomas. So I have been to St. Thomas many times, not many, but several times as a child, and a young adult, so that I can actually recall the memories of some of my family members and the trips there. However, I had never been back to Puerto Rico as an adult. So what I wanted to do, I decided, I think about 2016, that I wanted to be able to go there, exhibit there, and create works from that experience. And I reached out to a writer that I knew in PR and said, hey, this is my portfolio. Can you, and I already had a kind of a relationship with that person and knew that he appreciated my work and asked for a little bit of guidance. Through that connection, almost 2 years later, I was introduced to curator Norma Vila, who is at Corazon, and then arranged to do a series of visits, a talk, and literally I was supposed to have this, I still will have a solo exhibit, but it will be virtual. So the world has turned over, and so I will not have a literal or physical exhibit because that gallery is closed in that form. Not only because of COVID-19, but also because the amount of earthquakes that PR was having throughout 2019 and 2020. But even through all of that, I managed to visit PR for, I think, 4 times and lived there from January to, I want to say maybe up until 2 months ago. And the only reason I left, well, not the only reason, but the main reason we left is because of some of the progression of the COVID-19. But these are the works that I created, started there, and then finished in DC. This particular piece is Elemental, and it's elemental earth, air, water, fire. And I began to, I was looking at the, what do you call this? The rubber, what they call the rubber tree. And it's a beautiful, beautiful tree that reaches out from the bottom and has huge limbs and then thick trunk and comes up. And it has beautiful branches full, and it is almost like an ecosystem on top of the ecosystem, if that makes any sense. It literally has replicas of itself within its mass. And that imagery and that life, that ecosystem, really sunk into me. One of the other things that happened throughout this trip was that I spent the good earlier portion of the trip where documenting, researching, photographing, and I wasn't really thinking about materials in that sense. So when COVID-19 came upon and the restrictions that happened in Puerto Rico were so strict that I couldn't just venture to the art store. So I literally had to create with the supplies that I had at the time, because I still had deadlines. I still had work to finish. So if you look at this particular work, there's ink. I wasn't able to go and get the normal ink materials that I would normally get. Anyway, so it was a taxing, but I had to push forward and press on, because it was more important that I was able to not only document, but capture some of the feelings and information and people and energy that I was encountering while I was there. So that is that, and then you have the last work. And this one is Clotheslines, Community, and Eternal Energy. So that is the end of my talk. And last thing I want to say is please join me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and it's always my name, Amber Robles-Gordon. And thank you for this this time that you guys have shared with me.
Thank you, Amber.
So how do I get out of
there's raucous applause going. It's just in people's homes right now, but you can believe that for sure. So we have a few questions that have queued up already, and in order, I have Chelsea, Alyssa, Zoe, and Sarah who have articulated some questions. Should we just go in that order? Chelsea, do you want to?
Sure. Let me scroll up to my question. I wrote it down in the chat box when I thought of it. I'm just gonna find it real quick.
How do I stop sharing screen? Or maybe I shouldn't. Maybe there's a particular question about an image.
You might want to roll back to pieces.
Okay. So my question was that it seems that a lot of your work has an underlying narrative that has to do with either your relationship to a situation, condition in the world, or as a response to other art. And I'm wondering, when you're creating a series of work that explores a particular story or theme, how do you push yourself to go deeper? How do you know in your practice when, and maybe this is just very intuitive, but how do you know when you've transcended beyond just, you know, telling the narrative versus really finding something deeper? That's it.
That is a good question. I often think that it's sometimes the materials and not necessarily the actual concept that is pushing my exploration. And of course, at some point they do intertwine and they parallel each other. But I think it's an interchangeable conversation that happens for me between the intent, the concept, and or the materials. And I think it's about listening to yourself and the materials, whatever material that is that you are working and manifesting through. But I think it's really, it's about knowing yourself and being authentic with yourself and who you are, what you believe, following that energy. Because I often think that if you don't, in some shape or form, you'll have to answer to whatever happens because of that, henceforward, in some point or time.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Leslie, your question is actually a great follow-on to that, if you want to go ahead and ask it.
Sure. Hi. I was wondering for your process, when you create your works, do you start with a sketch or a draft, or are they more intuitive? Their intricacy and layering is very striking, so I was curious.
Thank you. It literally depends on what type of work that I am creating and who I'm creating it for. If it's something that I'm creating for myself, because I've been doing this for a very long time, I don't necessarily have to create a drawing or a rendering, but the person in me that wants to leave behind traces beyond the physical artwork, and that knows the value of process showing, sharing, to include not only hopefully future people that are looking at my work, future family that are looking at my work, and also just to also push the narratives that I'm trying to speak of and speak for. That little bugger in my head sometimes makes me go back and do some of the prep work that my experience sometimes say, hey, I don't want to do that. So it depends, but I would say it's good practice. And I don't mean just so that you can get that portrait done, or it looks like what it is, because I actually don't care about looking like what it is. It's about good practice of finite tuning your narrative, imagery, material, your key points that make you an artist, and a successful artist.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Zoe?
Thanks, Amber. You actually answered the question about how residencies help you further your practice. But I wondered about your self-created residency, and if you could just talk more about that, because that's a really wonderful thing to do. And I've seen a few artists that have talked about that, like, I'm going to go on to this trip for a month and, you know, just to make. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking with everyone about how you planned for that, how you resourced that, how you saved for that, all of the kinds of nuts and bolts for doing something like that.
So what that comes back to for me, although it is definitely good practice in relationship to what they say you should do as a professional artist. And I say they, meaning all the books, you know, the academia. There is that aspect, but there's also, for me, it was about my authentic self in relationship to what drives me, and what almost like feeds my spirit to some degree. If I didn't, if this wasn't so important to me in relationship to filling some of the gaps in my cultural lineage, I don't know that I would have pushed forward or put all that I have put into it to finish it. And so it's twofold. I definitely think that residencies are extremely important to the progression of an artist's career, but also an artist's ability to self-actualize. Not just in your actual, the progression of your work, but I think the progression of your spirit, your individual self. And then, like, for example, like literally there were earthquakes that were happening just every day, almost 3-4 times a day. And that they weren't necessarily where we were, but the notion of people even still contact me and saying, hey, you still good out there, you know, in PR. When you get to, depending on where you decide to have your residencies, whether self-actualized or you know, a prescribed definition or situation for residency, it really challenges you to set yourself outside of what your normal being daily interactions are. And you really, it's like you really figure out what is important to you and why. Mm-hmm. And it challenges you whether to move forward or recalculate, pull back. And the other thing I would like to say at this point is that, and if you happen to be in a residency that does not, or a situation where you are slated to do work or slated to do something specific to your career, and it's not fitted for you, get out. Mm-hmm. Because self-actualization, whether it's for your career or yourself, it should not hurt. It should not hinder. It should not. So I just wanted to make sure I put that out there. It should be fruitful to who you are as a person, an individual, and then who you are or who you're trying to become as an artist. And I hope that answers your question.
I love that you said that. Tim has an artist colleague that works at banks and would work at a bank for like 1 or 2 years in order to take off for a 3-month period. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really fantastic to know, and like you said, be your authentic self, really think about what's important for the work and why you're, you know, taking this time off, and what you can do to build up resources to do that. Mm-hmm. It seems really impractical, but it's doable.
Yeah. Okay. So I just realized I didn't answer the other part of your question. That was about the resources. Mm-hmm. So because this was a 3-year out plan in relationship to, excuse me, some of the funding came from like what I would call in-house costs in relationship to the university funding for space or some of my visits there, and or I had to do some fundraising for this, and or specific projects that I may not have wanted to do in relationship to time or constructs, but I did them anyway because I knew that I had to finish this. But then, you know, there's always life, you know, presents COVID-19 and earthquakes. So I did not finish the work there. I did not finish what I thought was going to be, you know, finishing that portion of this Puerto Rico experience for myself. But, you know, such is life in a way. I definitely welcome the opportunity to go back. I'm absolutely grateful that I had the perseverance to push forward and continue. Yeah, so it was definitely a process.
So Amber, do you have time for a couple more questions?
I absolutely do.
Great. Sarah? Sarah, you still here?
I'm here. Hi. Amber, it was dope to kind of see you.
Hey, Sarah.
Delayed response. It was really dope to see like genealogies of influence, but also like your decision making to utilize certain materials or motifs over time. And so I think one of the things that I was really struck by is across your work, whether two-dimensional or installation or public commission, that it always seemed like you were exploring environment and scale and space. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
That's interesting. So my first response is, to some extent, what else would I explore? And maybe that is just in relationship to what I am attracted to. Scale has always been something that has, just the same as materiality, that has intrigued me. The interesting thing about these works, if you guys notice, the ones that are still up, is that they're 18 by 24. And I usually work for the last, since 2013, majority of my my projects have been large scale, either public artwork or temporary or permanent installations. So I am kind of, I'm used to working very large. So for this particular work, this series, I had to scale down. And although I've done scaled down works and projects in between all of the public artwork, it is still a task to scale down. And so I'm happy and or like overly pleased at how these turned out, because if you had told me that I was going to be working this scale, I'd been like, yeah, no, that's not going to work for me. But I've always seen scale and materiality as like a challenge that I just wanted to climb to a certain degree. And if you notice throughout my works, like I will take, whatever geometric shape that the grid is, that I'm using to kind of have the platform for my grid, I will then change it, take it into different mediums and morph that grid. And that has always been a, like an underlying challenge, like a pleasure-driven challenge for me. And it is a way of, to some extent, processing the multidimensionalness, I just created a word, I believe, of life, and or then bringing that into manifesting these objects and or art beings out of, I don't know, these linear environments that we live in daily.
Thank you.
All right, Nico, you still here?
Yes, can everybody hear me? I'm having issues.
Yes, I can hear you. Hi, Nico.
Okay, hi. I'm interested in your presentation overall, in consideration of your deliberate decision and relevant decision to show your grad school work compared to more recent work. I really appreciate that as someone who just graduated, as others in this group have as well. And I find that interesting because many times we've had artists do visits in our academic career, and they have seems nothing to want to do with their graduate work, and it's so separate, and there's a time they don't want to acknowledge it. But for you, I saw that lineage and I saw how it's connected, and it's the background of your current work, and I appreciate that so much. So I was wondering, could you give us some tips about how we present ourselves going on from here when we have opportunities like this?
So I think the answer to your question is based in one of the things. So I didn't show a good portion, of course, of my pre-graduate work, but there are key aspects or key characteristics of my work. Like, for example, I mentioned the 5, color, womanhood, spirituality and nature, and materiality and recycling, that I have made so intricate in my practice, that I've then been able to follow them and see how they they continue to evolve, manifest, and incorporate in other works and other mediums. And I will say, so my graduate experience, I can't attribute everything to Howard University. Although you know, I love Howard. It gets on my nerves sometimes, but I still love Howard. And the experience that I was able to walk away with. However, there was the other aspect of my graduate experience that happened through an organization called Black Artists of DC. And so I always consider myself of having a dual master's program and experience, because the same time that I was at Howard, I was going through, I was part of that group. I started in as a, just like a regular member participant. And then I started curating with a wonderful woman named Barbara Blanco, who was also part of the group. And then I sat on their elders like council or board, and later became the vice president and then the president. So I also traveled, I represented it was a wonderful experience. And I mention that because those things, those narratives, although they were definitely important, embedded in who I am, my character, there were also other checks and balances to help solidify those things that kept me, this work being an authentic Amber Robles-Gordon. And if I can recommend anything, it's one, to figure out the rest of your identity to a certain degree, and figure out ways to support who that is. Because I do believe that works that you come out of grad school, and this might sound bad, but I still think that you should be able to show them and or talk about, and or if you need to dispute them, whatever it is, you still should be proud of them, you know. Good Lord. I graduated in 2011, so whatever years forward, now in 2020. But I also will then say that, you know, I've known I wanted to be an artist since I was 8. So, of course, I didn't know I was going to be doing things about womanhood or social injustice or the imbalances of masculine and feminine energy. But I am a true believer that if you figure out what fuels your energy, what fuels your spirit, what keeps you going, along with taking care of yourself, I believe that those things they'll manifest to you. And some of them you might not want to hear, and some of them you might have to challenge yourself. But I also think that is why you need an outside council of people that you can trust. And some of those people might flux in and flux out, and you got to let them flux in and you got to let them flux out. But you still need to have other people, other eyes, other influences, other narratives looking, assessing, and just somewhat viewing, critiquing your work. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, thank you. And luckily I've been trying to do that, you know, have a select few people that I can still get trustful feedback on my work and go forward, but it's still relevant. And you see the underpinnings of where my previous work informs my new work. So thank you, I really appreciate that.
And the last thing I want to say is, if you are not proud of your work, then you're doing the wrong type of work at any point.
Sorry. That's so, yeah. I'm gonna get that on a t-shirt.
Oh no, wait a minute.
Yeah, it'll say ARG.
It totally needs to be on a t-shirt. That was awesome.
That's, yeah. So there's a couple more questions, but I have to get on to another version of this experience, or another mediated meeting. And we've taken up a full hour and a half of your time. So I think we probably have to call it there. Thank you so much for everyone with us, and thank to all of you.
Thank you.
I really am looking forward to seeing these in person. I have a whole list of my own questions that
Thank you.
I want to say thanks to Zoe for the link annotating. That was providing us the direct access to that stuff all the way through. Amber, I don't know if you were seeing that all the way through, but you were basically,
I couldn't know.
You were live linked the entire time.
Thank you, Zoe.
I mean, smoothly too. That's All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Great job, Amber.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amber.
Amber. Bye, everybody.
Bye.